right. Good afternoon, church. It is so good to be spending this day with you and to be hearing the wisdom and joy of Jamie and Chris Brusoff. This morning was all theory, now it's all praxis, right? Or something like that. Those are words we use in seminary, so let's make it happen. Please help me welcome them back, and we look forward to...
Fabulous. You're going to stand on that side because we're not switching. I can't handle change.
This is my pew, and that is your pew.
There you go.
Okay. So what I hear you saying is that we're going to go from some of the theoretical bits and pieces and the big picture stuff to some of the smaller items, what we're doing, the practical nitty-gritty of what we do in ministry here. So that's kind of the plan. We talked it from empathy to action because what we've known, especially through watching people get to know Rebecca, is what people tend to do is love Rebecca. And through loving Rebecca, they then need to take a couple of steps to get to a place where they're loving the rest of the community, thinking a little bit bigger, going beyond the cute little kid in front of them to this is a bigger community that desperately needs to be in relationship with all of y'all. So,
and that we need to be in relationship
and that
with.
needs to be a part of what we are together, especially as church. So we're going to do some basics. Some of you may have this down really well. Some of you may be able to teach this. Some of you probably have. But we're going to do some basics around transgender LGBTQ community stuff. And then we're going to get into what you can do. And then because we know that conflict often arises from change in the church, and especially when we're talking about people's identities and how we intersect, we're going to talk a bit about conflict at the end and sort of ways that Jamie especially has found helpful when we do that.
Yep, and we're going to start with a story, which again, I share with the explicit permission of the person who is at the center of it. This is my friend Tor. Tor is a young person, they use they, them pronouns, a young adult now, grew up in a Lutheran congregation, absolutely adored their Lutheran congregation, was very involved, their family was involved, and it was a very safe place for them. And as they got to early adolescence, as they got older, they began to have some questions about their identity, specifically first their sexuality. And they realized at some point that they probably weren't straight. And as they figured this out, they wanted to know what their church thought about that. And they went to this lovely Lutheran congregation that had welcomed their family with open arms and raised young people up in faith in wonderful ways. And that congregation had never said anything bad about the LGBTQ plus community, but they'd never said anything good either. And so Tor, as a young person, was left wondering, what does my church, my faith, say about this? And so without that information, without anyone telling them otherwise, they went to Google and Googled, what do Christians believe? What do Lutherans believe? And they found some really harmful theology. And they were left feeling really deeply alone and as if somehow who they were coming to understand themselves to be was a mistake or not okay in the eyes of the God who created them. And those were some really challenging years for Tor until luckily staying connected to our synodical youth ministry and our outdoor ministry. They were connected to an out lesbian pastor who absolutely just blew their mind that that was a thing and was able to get access to some good theology, some affirming theology, and build a relationship with this new mentor. And so Tor was part of a group of young people in New Jersey who helped spur the creation of an event called Faith, Hope, and Love, Building Safer and More Welcoming Congregations for LGBTQ plus Youth. This group of high school youth said, we need to be having these conversations in the church, and we're not. And so in 2017, we held this first event. It was an intergenerational event From people gathered from across New Jersey. We had about 130 people ranging in age from 8 to 80. And it was this beautiful day rooted in stories, filled with resources, workshops, information, and so much more. And TOR was a driving force behind that. And so then when we had the next event, it became an annual event, TOR shared their story. And when TOR shared their story at this second Faith, Hope, and a Love event that they had helped make happen and been a part of the planning team for, they told exactly what I just told you about how they grew up and how they really struggled and then got access to affirming theology. And they begged at that point, 150 folks gathered to love a little louder, so that kids like TOR don't have to wonder if who they are is okay in the eyes of the God who created and loves them. And so love a little louder. I would say we need to love a lot louder. I appreciate that they set the bar so low for us, but we have a lot more volume in us, I believe it. And so that is how we get to that action. Everything we're going to talk about in this session is about loving louder. It's about being God's hands in the world and doing the work of building safer and more welcoming spaces for all people. So we're going to skip the curiosity continuum because we did that ahead of time. We're going to do a quick little primer on what we call SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Now, you may be really familiar with all the pieces of that. If so, awesome. Maybe something I share will help give you language to better explain it to other people. Or maybe this is all new to you, and then we're going to bring us all up to a kind of level playing field here as it is. And so the first thing you need to know when we talk about trans, non-binary, and LGBTQ plus people as a whole is there are lots of words, lots of terminology, lots of language. You don't need to know them all. You do need to know that the words matter and they're important to the people that use them to describe themselves, but you can listen to the language that people use to describe themselves and mirror that language back to them. Most importantly, we respect self-identification. So I'm going to trust that you all know yourselves better than I could ever know you, and I'm going to expect you to trust that I know myself better than you could ever know me. We listen to people when they tell us who they are. So that's the first thing. So the next thing is we have kind of 4 general continuum you'll often talk about when we talk about this community as a whole. The first one is we have sex. This is the sex assigned at birth. When a baby is born, we generally say it's a boy or it's a girl, or sometimes before they're born. Hopefully not with a really big elaborate gender reveal party. Not my favorite thing. And so we're taught that this concept of sex is very simple, very binary. It's either this box or that box, and that is all there is to it. But even on this basic body level, there is much more diversity in God's creation than most of us realize. People are born with intersex traits on a very regular basis. That's a trait that doesn't fit entirely into what is expected from typically female or typically male biology. And so that could be genetics, chromosomes, internal reproductive organs, or external genitalia. Even if we happen to know that, we're taught that that's really, really rare. But actually 1 to 2 in 100 births results in someone with an intersex trait. That's 1 to 2% of the population. That's as common as having red hair. And so when I meet someone, a natural redhead on the street, I don't go, oh my gosh, you're a special unicorn. I can't believe I met one of you in the wild. It's just a normal part of the diversity of humanity. And that's true for people with intersex traits as well. And so even on this basic body level, there's diversity, and understanding that is important. So next we get to gender identity. Gender identity is who you know yourself to be. It is a deeply held sense of self. You can't know someone's gender identity unless they tell you. We make assumptions all the time based on the next one, gender expression, which we'll get to, but those are just assumptions. Gender identity exists on a continuum from boy, man on one side, girl, woman in the other. And other words we might hear, sometimes we'll put them in the middle, but we'll talk about that in a second too, are non-binary, gender queer, gender fluid, agender, and so many others. Remember, you don't need to know them all, but you need to know that they're valid, they matter, and they're important to the people that use them to describe themselves. Peoples whose sex assigned at birth aligns with their gender identity are cisgender, C-I-S gender. That means, like, when I was born, they said, it's a girl, and I mostly know myself to be a woman. When someone's gender identity does not align with the sex they were assigned at birth, they are transgender. So when our daughter was born, we said it's a boy, but she deeply knows herself to be a girl. Everybody doing well so far? Awesome. Very proud of you. The next one we have is gender expression. Gender expression is how we express gender to the world around us, because gender, everything is gendered in our world. Remember that gender is historically contingent and culturally contingent. So if you go around the world or throughout history, you're going to have different ideas about what is feminine or what is masculine. So this is rooted in this space and time, but gender expression exists on a continuum from masculine to feminine, and in the middle we might say androgynous. We make assumptions about people's gender identity based on their gender expression. Two fun things about gender expression. First, it can change. There might be days where I am dressed in a hooded sweatshirt and a baseball hat and some jeans and some hiking boots because I'm going to go do whatever, and presenting in a more androgynous way. And there might be an occasion where I get dressed up to go to a fancy event and choose to wear a dress and high heels. It's really pretty rare. And then I might be presenting in a more feminine manner. Now, to be clear, those are like situational for me. You can present in an androgynous manner to fancy events as well, or you could present more feminine to go hiking. Those are just the examples in my life. So on any given day, your gender expression can change. Your gender identity doesn't, because your gender expression changes. So just because I wear something different, I'm still who I know myself to be. The other thing fun about gender expression is I think it's the best window into people who are not a part of the LGBTQ+ community to understand that most of us don't actually fit on the extremes of these continuum. I think most people who are not a part of the LGBTQ+ community are like, okay, check, 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 like down one side. That's where I am. The norms, the idea that that's what, like, the standards. When we look at gender expression, we can think about what does it mean to be feminine, like in our society today. So who is the most feminine public figure you can think of? You can just shout it out, and I will repeat it on a microphone so people online can hear. What was that?
Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift, absolutely. Who else? RuPaul. Who else? Kate Middleton.
Demure.
Rebecca would be so horrified. Anybody else? Beyonce. Jill Biden, absolutely. So we get all these ideas, and they will tell us a bit about what our society believes to be true about femininity all by itself. But I can look at all of those people, and sometimes, like if we do fictional characters, Barbie, like the Barbie craze, like that's very much, or the Disney princesses. These are all ideas about femininity. Well, I can think about all of those, and I don't express my gender anything like any of those, even though I was assigned female at birth. I mostly know myself to be a woman, so I'm going to put myself a little bit further in, not on the extreme. And we can do the same thing on the masculine side. Most masculine public figure you can think of? The Rock. Number one answer across age groups. It's amazing. Who else? Harrison Ford. Channing Tatum. Anybody else? Prince. I love it. Flipping some things on its head. So we get some ideas about what it means we believe to be true about masculinity in our culture. And this is when you get to say, you were assigned male at birth, you identify as male, and do you express your gender like any of those people?
I am just like The Rock. Obviously.
So he might put his gender expression a little further inward and not on the extreme of masculinity. And so you can think about your own self. And so I think what that helps us understand is that these tiny boxes, these binaries of what we say is okay to be if you're a man or a woman, are restrictive for all of us. None of us actually fit into these tiny boxes society gives us. And so as we break down those boxes, we make room for everyone to be more comfortably themselves. So that's gender expression. Great. Okay, next we have sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is completely separate from everything we've talked about so far. Gender identity and sexuality get confused a lot. When I had an 8-year-old daughter who came out as transgender, everybody immediately said, what does an 8-year-old know about sex or sexual orientation? Not much. It wasn't about that. It was about who she was, not who she experienced attraction to. So sexual orientation exists on a continuum, attracted to women on one side, attracted to men on the other. In the middle, we might have words like attracted to all, both, none. Words like bisexual, pansexual, polysexual, asexual, and so many others. We make assumptions about people's sexual orientation based on their past or current relationships. But we can't know someone's sexual orientation unless they tell us. So I'm bisexual. I've been in a monogamous marriage to a man for 20 years, and I'm happy to stay there, but I'm still bisexual. People assume I'm straight all the time. And so understanding that gender identity and sexual orientation are not things you can know unless someone tells you. Language, when we're talking about language and terminology, transgender is an adjective. We don't ever add the ED onto the word transgender. It's not transgendered. It's not something that happens to you. There's no transgender fairy that comes along and bops you on the head to transgender you into something else. It's an adjective that describes who you are. So you can be a transgender human, a transgender woman, a transgender man. It's an adjective. It is also not a noun. We don't talk about those transgenders. It's an adjective. And I think that's most of it. So once we have this kind of concept of terminology, the next tricky thing is that we kind of have to throw out these neat and tidy continuum, because what those continuum does is they situate us within relation to these norms. And we don't want to understand there to be norms and everyone else is outside of them. So that's the first thing. And then the other thing is, like, when we go back to that gender identity one I mentioned that in between identifying as a man or woman, man or boy or woman or girl, we might have words like non-binary. So someone who is non-binary understands themselves to not fit within these binary boxes of man or woman, but they don't necessarily know themselves to be halfway between or half man, half woman. If you talk to 10 non-binary people, you'd probably get 10 different definitions. Perhaps there's something else altogether, perhaps they're a mix of something, but it's not just like so neat and tidy. With non-binary identities, I think often we think of them as, like, you know those chocolate and vanilla twist ice cream cones you can get? And like with one being one gender and one being the other, and then we get the non-binary people, when really their entire flavor different altogether. And so just understanding that it's not as neat and tidy, and we don't want to fit people within these boxes that our brain so desperately wants to sort people into. Does that make sense? Any questions about terminology before I go on? That was just kind of your crash primer. Okay, we'll have time for more questions later, so if it comes up, that's okay. Okay. So now we're going to jump into practical. What can you do? Right. Okay.
So we did say earlier, right, you got to...
Your picture's not there, but that's okay.
That's okay. I don't know what happened to St. Paul, but he disappeared. One of the things we do as folks who are doing ministry in whatever capacity is we need to learn some things. You just learn some things. Even if you knew it ahead of time, that's sort of what we're trying to do. Now that we know some things, what are we going to do with it? Why should you include, insert identity here, in your ministry, in our church? What does that look like? Do we do that because it makes us feel better? We've given those people a place to come. Do we do that to check a box so that we can say, yes, we've got all these folks checked off, and that's lovely because it makes us look like we're doing all the things we're supposed to do? Or do we do it so that we can both be the image of God in the world, and because when we more fully include all of the people who are made in God's image, we more accurately reflect God's image in the world around us? It seems to me that I prefer the last ones, but that's sort of the ground level basis for why we're going to do the things we're doing when we go from here. And that's not just for this community. That happens to be true, I think, for all of the marginalized communities that especially the church has historically done harm to. There's some theology that we could talk about.
I'm going to pause you for a second. You're welcome to take pictures of this slide. I will also have a QR code at the end where if you submit your email, I will send you this and a whole bunch of resources from everything you've seen up there.
Yeah.
So continue.
I made a metaphor the other day when we were sitting at the kitchen table because we were talking about theology. We said, we're going to be at the seminary. We got to do something about the Bible and theology. And I said, here's the thing. I'm a pastor. And as a pastor, I sort of think of myself as the home cook version of theologian. And there are other people around, especially in this room, in these buildings, who are more like the Master Chef level of theologian. So if you want that, we've got some resources. There are other resources here. We can go into that. I will tell you, these at least we've looked at, and we know that there is value in all of these. Some of these are used in Jamie's book. You'll see them in there, and sort of used around the conversation about Scripture especially, and how we intersect that way within this community.
Yeah, the number one thing that I want to pull out and recommend would be Austin Harkey's Transforming the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians. It's truly an excellent, accessible, whether you are looking at it from a heady academic place or even your average layperson can very slowly work their way through because it is dense. But there's a lot of really good stuff, and the most recent updated and expanded edition also comes with a forward from Rebecca and myself, which is an added bonus.
The other thing I will say is that almost all of these are written by people who identify as part of the community. And like Jamie and I said at the beginning, we don't speak for the community, but I think one of the things we know as church and as people who have attempted some scholarship in the church is that when we're exploring theologies, those theologies best come from people in the communities that are sort of teaching us what it means to be a part of this, family of God kind of thing. So I would point you in their direction long beforehand. If you have easy questions, we'll take them later.
So as we start to talk about the why do we do this and the work of inclusivity, it needs to be integrated into everything we do. That means it needs to flow from our theology, be rooted there. We do need a basic enough understanding to understand why we're doing this. I go back to the body of Christ a lot, and which is why we had a picture that didn't show up of Paul on the previous slide. It needs to flow from our theology, from our mission, our vision, and our core values into every area of our work. Because if it doesn't, one of two things is going to happen. One, when it gets hard, if it does not come from the root of who we are, and it will get hard, people will say, I don't like this. Why are you getting political? I'm going to take my money or my toys and go home, whatever it is. If it does not come from the root of who you are and who you're called to be in the world, you will give up. You will say, oh, just kidding. I mean, we can dial that back a little. You have to understand the why. The other thing that could happen if it is not integrated into everything you do is that you will do more harm. And what that means is we talked about those visible symbols. We talked about having your RIC symbol or a rainbow or these little clues that people are looking for as you navigate the world. Well, if you have some of those clues, if you care enough and said, well, we're going to slap a rainbow flag out front and we're good. Well, if you haven't done the work and understand how this plays into every piece of your ministry, from your theology to your worship, to your facilities, to your youth programming, to everything your congregation does or any other ministry setting, then someone is going to see those little clues, come to your setting and let their guard down a little because they think they should be safe there. And with their guard down, they're going to be harmed more than if they were to proceed cautiously. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to be able to do it all at once, but it's just that we have to think through the implications and be doing it in a holistic way as we go through this work and continue working as we move forward. So it has to be rooted in everything we do and start from the very crux of who we are. Nope, I skipped one. Go back. My clicker doesn't like me. We'll just use that. What's happening?
One more.
I know it's not going. Okay, so the slide that I can't get to come up, which may just be disappeared, that's okay. Next we talk about what does it look like to do this in all of those areas. And so we can start with where you are. You want to start wherever you are. Again, we talked about that marathon, mile 1 to 21, or mile 1 to 26, and you're not going to get from mile marker 1 to even mile 15 in one leap. And so we start with where we are. Maybe pronouns are something you can introduce. Maybe it's language. Can you pay attention to the language you're using for God in worship or in Bible study or in any other times? Can you consider, are you including all kinds of groups of people in your prayers or your sermon illustrations? Are you naming LGBTQ plus people and specifically trans and non-binary people from the pulpit? That matters. Seeing people in leadership. Eventually, we want to see young people and people of all ages to be able to see themselves in the leadership of our congregations. And so does that mean you have trans people serving on council or serving in worship? And like that's the mile 26 perhaps for some of you all, and you're like, I don't even have any in my building. Where are we going to get to that? And so you move along. When you think about your facilities, so like these are all points of accessibility. What does it look like? You can look at your facilities and say, okay, well, what do our bathrooms look like? How can we be the most accommodating and hospitable to people that may feel uncomfortable in gendered spaces? Do we have signs on our bathrooms that make it clear that you can use the bathroom that feels best for you? Do we have an all-gender single stall restroom that locks, that could make people feel comfortable and that's beneficial to people far beyond just trans and non-binary people? All sorts of people want more privacy. And so is that something you can do? How do you communicate to people and visitors about those things that you have? You can go through administration. What do your forms say? When you collect Sunday school registrations, do you ask for gender? Do you have an option for non-binary? When you collect information from families, is it parent 1 and parent 2? Or do you have mother or parent guardian 1, parent guardian 2? Or do you have mother and father still? Like there's all sorts of levels where you kind of have to do an audit and dig deep into all of these places where these gendered ideas are just so, they've been the air we've all been breathing for our whole lives. And so we may not notice it, but they are certainly things that are barriers to people's full involvement in our congregations.
So really drilled down. We already had a family restroom, a single occupant family bathroom at the church. How easy is it to change the sign that says family to all gender, which seems pretty obvious? Now, it may start a conversation. Some people may see that and feel like you're doing it just because of a population. I would argue that's okay, because we do all kinds of things just because certain communities need different things to feel welcomed. But I think that's a really practical thing that when you look around is also a fairly low bar. When you're doing those Sunday school forms, or any kinds of forms for that matter, first ask the question, do we actually need to know gender? Is that important for what we're doing right now? To have a bunch of kids sit around a table and do Sunday school, do we need to know their gender for any reason whatsoever? And if the answer is no, then we don't ask, because it's not important to what we're doing. And that's kind of, on that level. When we train our Sunday school teachers, that's a crazy idea all by itself. Let's train Sunday school teachers. But when we do, are they breaking up classrooms again into boys and girls? Because that's what happened when they were in Sunday school. Or can we break up classrooms? You do this with youth groups too, when you do icebreakers and a whole bunch of other places. Can we do it in some other way? Pick a metric. It doesn't matter. Everybody's birthday before June, everybody's birthday. You'll be amazed at how easily you can break groups up into 2 separate groups that are almost equal size without having to resort to gender, which asks people to out themselves every time you do it. And outing yourself is not something that feels hospitable.
And that goes for throughout congregational life. When you are singing in parts, can you do higher voices and lower voices instead of men and women? And that's more inclusive for everyone, because there are women who would more comfortably sing with the lower voices. And so many of these things that we work to create more gender inclusive spaces benefit everyone, because again, it's breaking down those boxes and not shoving us into arbitrary groups that may not fit with all of who we are. And so starting to understand, do this. I used to tell people, do this before you think you have to. Like, do this before there's a young person in your midst. And a couple years later now that I've been saying that, you're past that. I guarantee you there are families in your midst, whether you know it or not. There are young people in your midst, whether you know it or not. So it's not even do this before you think you have to now. And so It's not fun for a family or an adult or anyone to feel like they are the reason you're creating policy around them. And so it's important for you to understand that this is just part of being a congregation or a ministry setting of any kind. When it comes to like youth ministry, do you have policies? Do you make clear what you do for housing when it comes to retreats? What are the vendors that you use in your congregation? Are they affirming, LGBTQ plus affirming, or are they mixed? Do you know their stance? If somebody encounters a resource in your congregation, oh, we pay this people, and they go to look them up and find that they have really harmful theology, well, that's gonna like do harm. That's gonna cause harm. So paying attention to the values of everyone you work with. Doing education and advocacy. And so we started to talk about this a little bit during the questions in the first session, but starting educational opportunities, there is so much confusion among people, everywhere in this country right now about this community. And so can you host a conversation? Can you host a community event? Can you bring in a speaker, do a book study, and be an opportunity, not around someone's specific identity in your community, but just an opportunity to learn about more of God's children. And then, once you've done some learning, it's the natural next step to figure out how can we advocate for more of God's children. And when we talk about advocating, it's about making your voice heard at every level. And so Board of Eds are really important right now. Knowing what your school boards are doing and using your voice there, making sure that people know that you care as a person of faith, as leaders of faith, libraries, town councils, depends on your town, those can be really action-filled or not. State, and then of course federal. And so having relationships with your legislators, even if there isn't something already, a bill that's currently being discussed, reaching out and saying, hey, I'm your constituent, this is who I am, and this is something I care about. That matters, even if your legislators are entirely affirming and always voting in ways that you think are best for the humanity of all people. They need to hear from you so they can say, my constituents are telling me this, so they can have your stories. It is just as important for them to hear from you as those who are voting against the humanity and dignity of people.
I would say it's more important. One thing we know when we're talking about negative and positive reinforcement is that that positive reinforcement goes way farther. When you, especially you as faith leader, tell everybody from the librarian to your, senator that you are grateful for the vote that they cast or for the books that they brought in or the program they created, in a positive way, you will wipe out a half a dozen of the very loud negative voices they are already hearing. It's more important on some level to talk to the people who are doing the things we agree with and let them know that you think they're doing a good job, because they are getting beaten up by those who disagree with them, and they need that. That is a pastoral care thing. So.
And it's not just you, like you as faith leader, absolutely, and then equipping your people to say this is what it means to live out our faith, and this is how to do it, and giving them information and making it easy. Here's some scripts. This is how you can call. There's all sorts of resources available. ELCA Advocacy has some. Many of our synods have resources. If not, reach out to me and I will get you resources.
A lot of your state-based equality organizations have those resources. Many of them are now creating resources for communities of worship. I'm emailing back and forth with one right now. And there are also community organizations locally that you could probably lean on to either do some of those community events that Jamie was talking about. There might be a GLSEN or a PFLAG or some other organization near you that can be a partner with you in helping to educate and welcome folks through and with your site.
You don't have to be the expert. Lean on the people that are the experts. If it's theology, fine, use your expertise, gather resources, but if you're talking about what's going on in your community and the resources that people need, lean on those community orgs so they build a relationship with you. They can send people to you when people are looking for safer places, and you can send people to them and know the resources that are. Those kinds of relationship buildings are so critical. We could go on and on as far as like the nitty-gritty practical things you can do, and there's a whole lot in the book, and there's lots that I can email after too to give you more resources. But the next thing that we have to talk about is what happens when people disagree. What happens when you do some of these things and all of a sudden people are up in arms because this isn't what we're supposed to do? Why is church getting all political? Why do you only care about that group of people? All of those kinds of things are things that we hear, and we know we will. And so the primary thing is that we have to go back to who you are, your theology, mission, vision, core values. Know why you're doing what you're doing and have a strong foundation there. Because when you hit pushback, you're going to go back to that and be reminded, this is why we're doing it, and so we're going to keep moving forward. Establish boundaries. We talked about this a little bit before, like what is okay and what is not okay. Be clear about those community expectations. We don't have to agree. We don't all have to believe the same. We don't have to all vote the same. In fact, churches are one of the rare places where we still come together in community with people who are different from us across all sorts of identity lines, from socioeconomic, political, all of these things. And as much as there are days when I dream of the utopia where we all believe the same thing, that's not actually what the kingdom of God looks like here on earth. The diversity of opinions and experience is part of the beauty of being children of God. And so we do have to figure out what it means to be in community together and how do we care for one another. And so establishing those boundaries and being clear about community expectations, and then caring for all involved. It means we care about the most marginalized, certainly. So, the transgender child in our midst, or the adult, or what does that look like? But we also care about the person who is struggling, who says, I believe deep in my heart that this is wrong and this is not what God says. And we can care about them just as much as long as we're making the most vulnerable as safe as possible in the process. We don't want to go to blame and shame, which is so easy, especially as we get more fatigued by the rhetoric we're hearing around all of these conversations. But shame and blame don't ever move anyone towards inclusion. It's not healthy, and it's not what we're called to do or be in the world. This thing hates me now. Maybe.
Again.
Nope. Make it go.
We were doing so good the first part. I don't know.
know. I'm afraid to hit it.
I mean, I hit it like 15 times at this point. It's too
All
late.
right, well, you deal with that. I'll just keep talking. So what I think is the next slide will
Unsafe
be
versus
the difference between being unsafe and uncomfortable. And so those are two very different things, and we use those words interchangeably a lot. And so understanding that they are different and that we care for everyone in our midst is important. The example I will use for this is we're going to take a kid in a bathroom at a school, because this is a story that we hear a lot. We said beyond bathrooms, but we're going to talk about bathrooms for a hot second, because it's just an easy example. So say you have a little girl who says, I am uncomfortable using the bathroom with that child who I've known as a boy my whole life, and who says they're a girl. And maybe it's used with some clunkier language or some more inflammatory language, whatever it is, that child is uncomfortable. We can care about the child who is uncomfortable. But what we're not going to do is make a child unsafe in the hopes of making someone else more comfortable. And that's what would happen if we told the transgender child that they couldn't use a bathroom that aligns with who they are. And we have data that shows this. Trans and non-binary people are unsafe when not affirmed, when they are not affirmed as who they are and given access to spaces that align with their identities. We see this in the mental health outcomes, the levels of anxiety, depression, suicidality, and whatnot, and risk-taking behaviors that then come from that. But we also know that they're more at risk for assault and harassment in these gender-segregated spaces. And so they are unsafe. And so if we were to tell that child, well, you can't use that bathroom, you have to use that one because you've made this little girl uncomfortable, that would be making them unsafe. And so we're not going to do that, but we are going to care deeply about the child who is uncomfortable. That child's not unsafe. When a little girl goes into a bathroom with a transgender little girl, nothing happens. They go to the bathroom. And if something else happens, then that's a whole different problem altogether and has nothing to do with either of their genders. And so we can talk to the girl who is uncomfortable and say, I understand. What do you need? What would help you? You can work through and be a safe place for those feelings. You can offer her different accommodations. You can use this single stall restroom. You can use a nurse's bathroom, whatever those are, and you can collaborate while not shaming or blaming her. But we are not going to make someone unsafe in the name of making someone else more comfortable. This goes the same if we're talking about theology that is non-affirming. If you have someone in your congregation who feels the need to shout that, the Bible says trans people are going to hell, or whatever nonsense is coming out of their mouth, they may feel uncomfortable hearing affirming a theology and words that do not match with what they know to be true and don't feel like it aligns with their view of the world and their view of religion, faith, whatever that may be for them. They are not unsafe. We know that trans and non-binary people are unsafe when they hear that kind of language, when they hear that who they are is wrong in the eyes of the God who created them, that has real, statistically shown impacts on their mental health and well-being, which then translates to also their physical health and well-being. And so we don't have to say we don't care about you who are uncomfortable, but we're not going to allow that to be said and make the person unsafe in the hopes of making that person more comfortable. And so we go back to those boundaries and expectations and show up for that person in relationship and figure out how we can best move forward. Does that make sense? I find that this difference is really helpful because people often throw around the word unsafe when we know that there's nothing actually unsafe about it. And so being able to talk about the difference while being clear that we care for everyone involved, that care just needs to look a little different so that we do not further marginalize a vulnerable person and make them further unsafe. Still no slides? Cool. Okay. Yes?
Here's an update. IT is remoting into your laptop. They're like repelling.
I see that.
Okay.
And they're going to try to, they're rebooting it.
I felt like it needed to be restored.
All good.
Well done from back there in the window.
Wonderful.
Yep.
So then the other thing that I would say is that as we talk about unsafe and uncomfortable and navigating these things in community, is that we have to, I've mentioned a few times, like the most vulnerable. So we work with a series of concentric circles, and this is commonly referred to as ring theory. You may have heard it as the circles of grief, kind of. When we talk about it in grief, when someone experiences loss, we put them, the person closest to the loss, in the center of a series of concentric circles. So perhaps it's someone who lost a spouse, and so that spouse is in the middle who experienced that loss, and then the people in the next ring might be close family members and friends, and then the next are further, family members and friends that are further out, and then maybe it's the neighbors down the street, and then there are professionals that are there to provide care, and so on. And we want support to go in and processing to go out. And so what we don't want is the neighbor down the street coming to a widow and saying, I'm struggling so much, like it's not her job to care for that person. And so support goes in, processing goes out. And so that neighbor down the street should go to a further out circle for that support and just show up with casseroles or whatever that may look like for the person down the street who experienced this loss. And so when we talk about vulnerable people in our communities, we put them in the center. And so say it's a transgender child, and we did this with Rebecca. We put her in the center of these series of concentric circles. And then maybe, her parents and siblings were in the next circle, and then our extended family, and then so on, and then friends and community members, church members, support went in, processing goes out. And so that rule that we said, hey, church members, you can have all the questions you want, but you can't ask Rebecca or ask them in front of Rebecca, was part of that saying, processing goes out. It doesn't go in on her. We hear this a lot from family members who experience a loved one transition, come out as transgender and go to living as who they know themselves to be. We'll hear them struggle. They'll use words like grief. Grief is such a hard word for trans people to hear because they hear that someone is grieving them when they are more alive than they've ever been. But those feelings are valid. They just don't belong put on the trans person. They belong going out to those outer circles of people that can help you support and process. And so if you have this visual, it helps you understand who is supposed to be asking who for help and where do those feelings go while protecting those in the inner circles in our midst. Yay, that was the slide we missed. Okay, keep going to the next one. Yep. See, I did pretty good with that. There's my pretty picture of my concentric circles.
That's it.
Okay, I'm just watching our time. So as we do all of these things, again, there's so many nitty-gritty things you can do, but educating, the misinformation and disinformation in the world right now is so rampant. And so whatever you can do to educate your people and mobilize them to show up in personal ways as well as in clear advocacy ways when it comes to the world around them is really powerful. And as I think about the church, there was a question that I used to ask often. It was rooted in that Faith, Hope, and Love event that I told you about. We used to ask, what are your holiest and wildest dreams for LGBTQ plus youth in the church? And so often I will ask, what are your wildest and holiest dreams for trans and non-binary young people in the church? And people would come up with stuff that was like, that they be accepted, that they know God loves them, that they, like all these really good things, but at some point I started to go like, is that the bar? Like that's the best we can do, is that they are loved and know God loves them, that they are supported? And talking with Rebecca about this, we came to that I want trans and non-binary people to be so integrated into the fabric of our church that the church would be unrecognizable without them. That's the goal. And as we hear people wonder or comments about the church is dying, or is the church isn't dying, let's be clear. But we hear all these concerns, and I go back to the youth gathering. I'm coming off, this recent experience in this summer. And there's Rebecca again in the midst, helping lead worship on stage on Saturday morning for, 16,000 high school youth and adult leaders, serving communion with the presiding bishop, and understanding who she is and what it means for her to be up there, but it's so much more than that. Young people, and let's be honest, people of all ages, want a church where they can see themselves reflected. Not just in the people we do service for, but the people that are building the table that is who we are and what we do in the world. And so as I think about all these pieces and the way we move along this marathon from mile 1 to mile 26, it's getting closer to a church and a world where everyone knows that they belong in that space, in our churches, at every level of leadership, not to be invited to a table built by someone else, but to actually build something new and different together. And that's where my hope, I say hope a lot, and so I kind of end on the idea of hope. That's where my hope comes from, that we can build a church where trans and non-binary people and all of the beautiful gifts they bring are so integrated into it that we would not be able to recognize this church without them. Because that's what looks more like the kingdom of heaven here on earth. That's what the body of Christ looks like. And so with that, we have about 12 minutes, so I'm told I can go a little over if needed, for questions. And this is the QR code. If you scan this, or if you don't want to scan a QR code, you can type in bit.ly/ULS Convocation, all lowercase, and you will be able to put in your email address. In about 2 days, give me 2 days, I will send an email with these slides and a whole bunch of resources that get into all of the things that I didn't get to tell you today because we'd need a week together or a semester together or whatever the case may be to dig into what this looks like on all the levels. I'm so grateful for your time and your attention, and I'm excited to hear what other thoughts or questions you may have after some lunch and this latest of me rambling. I let him talk some, I swear.
Oh, Tony figured out his question.
He did.
I did say I had a question. Thank you so much for this conversation. I have a data-related question. Back to your very early chart about Gen Z. Mm-hmm. And the 30%, pushing 30% representation of, was it the full LGBTQ plus community?
Absolutely.
Identifying that way.
Yep.
So I was in a conversation with someone, who by the way is a millennial, about this, and this person was well versed in those statistics as well. And this person gave me the kids these days response, and I'm sure everybody in this room has either been on the giving or receiving end of that comment, no matter what generation we're in, right? Mm-hmm. But that's the response that I got. Mm-hmm. It's trendy. Everybody's doing it because it's trendy.
Yeah.
It's cool things to do. They just want to, they just want to feel cool. I guess I'm asking for advice.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that comment? And I'll take my question offline.
Yes.
Or answer offline.
Thank you for the question. And I would say there are some nuance levels to that. First of all, because of the access to information that I talked about before and the awareness of this conversation, young people are having conversations and are exploring their identities in a way that most of us didn't do as young people. It's the reason I came out as queer in my late 30s. Like, that is something, and that's very common. We see people coming out as trans, as all of these things, as LGBTQ later in life because they didn't have the language or the information or the resources to do that.
So it's trendy to figure out who you are and be proud of it. It's trendy to actually take a minute as a kid in school and look at yourself and say, wow, I figured this out about myself and I'm going to tell people about it and live that identity proudly. And you know what? That doesn't sound like a bad thing to me.
Well, and that can be true. And there's also the fact that exploring, some of these young people who are exploring and trying on different identities may not end up being those identities forever. They are exploring. And that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. Because then we end up with adults who know themselves better than most of us did, certainly at that age, some of us than we do at this age. And so what does it look like to create space? So then the question that comes next is, well, what if they change their mind? What if they change their mind?
If the worst possible thing that happens, I like this
Go
one,
ahead, do it, I know.
is that somebody who identifies as male has spent a couple of hours, days, or weeks figuring out what it might be like to identify as a woman in our society. Again, that doesn't sound like a bad thing to me.
And also, if they have
There's always an and also.
If they have been met with love and support and affirmation and learn to trust the people around them, that they're going to listen to them when they tell us who they are, and then when they say, actually, this isn't me, this is actually me, then they will develop self-trust. They will develop trust in the people around them. They will have relationships that will carry them through. They will have a stronger foundation of that love from the people around them being truly unconditional. That's really powerful. Now, jumping before the next question that will be, well, what about medical stuff? What if they go down this path and there's all sorts of medical changes that are happening, during the school day, as we discussed?
The other side of that, too, is I don't know that it's actually ever trendy to put yourself out in the world as yourself, different from all your peers when you're in middle school or high school. Let's be very clear. No high schooler actually wants to be totally different than all of their peers. So I would also push back on that same conversation and say, I think you need to go talk to some high school kids because that's not actually a thing. They all would like to be, at least in some part, recognized as part of a community, even if it's going to be at different lunch tables, right? Like we've seen that movie play out.
And it may be that they're finding some of that community in a queer group
Sure.
of students, and so they're saying, oh, maybe this is me, and maybe it isn't eventually, and that's okay.
Not such a bad thing.
I was going to say something else, but I lost it, but I'll go back to the medical stuff. So medical stuff, and I kind of danced around it a couple of times here, understand that surgeries aren't happening on young children, and no irreversible medical steps are available without many checks and balances, and or hoops to jump through, depending on which way you look at it. And so we have actually half of the states in the country have banned gender-affirming care for youth, which is a problem, and that's being fought in various courts. But even those, when we're looking at the best practice of care, the first step is puberty blockers, which hit the pause button on puberty and allow young people space to understand who they are and figure out that without going through a puberty that doesn't align with who they know themselves to be. These medications have been used for a long time to treat all sorts of things, including young people with cancer and going through precocious puberty, when a body goes through puberty before we want it to. And so they're just a pause button. If you stop administering it, the body will go through puberty as it was assigned at birth. The next step is access to gender-affirming hormones, which could be estrogen or testosterone. That doesn't happen at minimum generally 13, 14 up. It's pretty rare. There's really rare 12s because some start really, really low and slow. You're not hitting irreversible changes until later in those years because of the way it's dosed. And that doesn't happen without full family support, without mental health care practitioners along with endocrinologists and gender practitioners as a team saying this is the right thing for this young person. There's a multidisciplinary team of experts working with each family and young person to figure out what is the best step for them. And it is very specific, and there are guidelines that are carefully followed. And so, fine, you've got 13, 14, 16, and on up for these hormones, and then you have this whole concept of surgeries. First of all, not everyone who is trans or non-binary ever has surgery for a variety of reasons. Maybe that's not something they need to feel good in their body. Maybe they have a medical condition that would mean that that was not a good medical step for them to take. Maybe they don't have insurance or access to cover that because many insurances still do not cover that. And it's an extremely expensive procedure. Plus, there are multi-year wait lists for many surgical providers. It's not an easy thing to access. And when we're talking about surgery, it's primarily 18 plus. There are some rare exceptions in 16 and 17-year-olds, specifically trans masculine people, for top surgery, because it is a less invasive surgery that is also, there's so much dysphoria, which is the word that describes the struggle experience when your body doesn't match who you know yourself to be, that's associated with navigating the world with a large chest if you know yourself to be a man. But again, then you need 2 mental health care providers to have walked with these people for years, and that's true even if you're over 18 to get surgeries. So understand that this is a wraparound system, that nothing is being done flippantly or without care or caution, and there are so many people involved in the decisions, at times to a fault, that they can feel like barriers to care, and other times it works perfectly as is to help create the best path forward. And so when we talk about, is it a trend, are they taking this medication, getting a surgery, or whatever else at school, that's not happening, and that's not, they have to know who they are, and the 3 words that are used are consistent, persistent, and insistent, meaning consistent every day, persistent over a period of time, and insistent, meaning this is a critical part of who they are, and they are in distress if it is not recognized. So that's kind of my long-winded response, and appreciate the input there about what it looks like, and understanding that the world is a really hard place. We can also go back to all those statistics and all of that legislation. In the end, even if someone's exploring, maybe it is because their friend group happens to be a whole bunch of queer people, and they're like, yeah, they're not going to keep doing it in the face of everything in front of them unless it's who they are. Other questions?
Within the advocacy that you all have been doing, I am curious within our own context if you have had advocacy conversations around bound conscience and how those have gone.
Yes. You want to say anything, or you want me to go?
I was going to throw the church council thing under the bus first.
Okay. Well, yes, I am not here speaking as a member of ELCA Church Council, but I am on ELCA Church Council. No, but if we go back from our last churchwide assembly, we have convened a committee that is, or a team, or whatever, the reconsiderations team, that is looking at, they've been charged with first, coming up into our 2025 churchwide assembly, we will be coming with corrections or adjustments or proposed changes that will bring the statement, the sexuality statement, in alignment with understanding that marriage is legal for people of same genders, and so to reflect that. So that's the first change. So we have this team compiled. They have been meeting, which is wonderful, and that is the first thing they're going to address. Would I love for them to be able to get to more than that before 2025? Yes, but that's where we're at. But then they are tasked with, from between 2025 and 2028, coming up with reconsidering the 4 positions of perspective, including bound conscience. And so I am grateful that that is happening. It is a long and slow process. I would say, yes, we come up against this all the time on some level. I think we even see it, I mean, I've come up against it in working with ELCA advocacy. What can we say and what can we not? Our church comes out with some really powerful affirming statements, but also we have to, technically, our church leaves room for these other things. And so what does that look like and how do we navigate it? And we don't always navigate it well. Whichever direction we end up, it's messy. It is messy. And so I think for me, it really comes down to those boundaries and those expectations and the theology, vision, mission, vision, and core values of an individual ministry setting to say, this is how we're living this out here. This is what it looks like to do this here. And I think, I mean, I'm grateful for a lot of the work Churchwide has done to say this is who we are as a church. Yes, we create space. All beliefs can be welcome here, but all behaviors are not. I mean, that's some of what we're doing in that statement. I will say, I mean, even like when we talk about insurance and medical stuff, like ELCA insurance covers all the gender affirming care that we need. Puberty blockers, you know, my daughter, and I share this with her consent, was able to get her puberty blocker when she was 11 years old. It's a little implant in her arm that costs $30,000. And we have to jump through all sorts of hoops to get it. ELCA insurance paid for it. And so like we are doing some important things as far as how we show up to work on the ground and advocate for things while also holding space for this difference of opinion and understanding while knowing that we are hitting a critical point, which is what came to the last churchwide assembly to say we can't continue to hold this space in theory. Now, I don't know where that team will come from. I am on the committee that's going to receive those recommendations, so it'll be interesting. But yeah, that's kind of it's messy, and I think we continue to try to navigate it, but I do think that all beliefs can be welcome here while all behaviors are not is kind of something to keep coming back to.
On a congregational level, I think the advocacy piece happens in all those relationship-built conversations. I don't know a lot of congregations that are particularly concerned with bound conscience, as much as maybe they should be. A lot of them have figured out one way or another since 2009, where they've kind of fallen. And you see that either explicitly or implicitly through their sort of what they do in the world. I think as policy, it's probably a lot harder for our synods and our seminaries. Mm-hmm. Because there's a lot more structure that they have to or feel they need to keep level with those statements. So we love having conversations with seminaries and synods, but we also know that sometimes that's where the biggest blockade happens in terms of support, right? Because we don't know how to do both things at once all the time.
Yeah. There's something else I was going to add, but it's gone. I welcome a question.
For me in my journey as a child of God, there has been wonderful gifts that I received from Scripture, and I saw in the resources that in one. But there have been wonderful resources that have been provided to me by a spiritual director and spiritual resources. Do you have spiritual resources available in what you offer so that the young people might be able to traverse that piece of them? Mm-hmm. Because I know from being a spiritual coach that our growth as a spiritual person is always enhanced through a struggle. And those who struggle earlier in their lives are farther along on the spiritual journey than those who don't. So just curious about that question.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. I think there's some really valuable resources that are coming out for young people as far as navigating their identity and their faith as an LGBTQ plus young person. One of the books that was listed up there is part of a duo, that one is for parents and adults and one's for young people. We also, the LCA is putting out the queer confirmation program, which they're trialing right now, which is exciting, and is in, they've started some testing groups that they're trying it out for to get feedback. And so that's exciting to see those examples. I also think that people who do this work, both in youth ministry, but also in ELCA coaching and in spiritual direction, are being really clear about who they are and how they can serve. And so being able to connect, maybe not youth at that point, but young adults to those types of resources to be able to walk on that journey alongside them. I will say, and again, I share this with her consent, which I always preface things with, but it's important, that like Rebecca has really struggled with her own faith as someone who grew up in a family like she did, grew up in the church, has been loved and supported, but constantly hears her identity being vilified by people of faith, who hears the Bible used as a weapon against her. And so how do you understand that? How do you reconcile your identity as a Christian when that is what's happening out there, and kind of be okay with that? And the other thing that she finds is that, like, people in the LGBTQ community are shocked to find out that she's Christian, and people in the church community are shocked to find out she's trans, and that they're not mutually exclusive, and that you can be both, but there's not a lot. Like, we are growing, honestly, even just the last 5 years in representation for that, and that's so critical. And it's part of the reason the book exists. And there's some things for walking through families and young people with that. But the thing that I always say is that I want people, parents and people who care about young people, to know that they don't have to choose between their faith and their child. They might have to choose between their child and their church. And that's just the truth of it. And so what does that look like to create those spaces and continue to raise up those resources? So I would say there are some, and it's growing, but we need more. Yeah.
There are some good commentaries coming out scripturally. There's a couple of decent podcasts that look at lectionary-based stuff from a queer perspective. And some of those kind of naturally take themselves to some spiritual places, and I think are especially helpful if you're looking for a queer lens when preaching. Mm-hmm. And that's a good spiritual intersection for the folks experiencing that.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for maybe one more question, if there is one.
I serve on the Synod's anti-racism team, so I'm familiar with the idea of uncomfortable is not the same as unsafe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
With these issues, though, I wonder if there's sometimes where it's not, that distinction isn't so clear, that somebody, given their history, may really feel unsafe. And I just wondered if you had any insights on how, when you've got competing vulnerabilities, how do you deal with that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think, and that's the problem, is it starts to feel as competing vulnerabilities, or the, like, if we're lifting up this community, then you don't care about me anymore. And so I think using the foundation of we deeply care about all of God's children and what does this look like, and then looking at some of the policies and practices. And so, for instance, again, taking something simple, instead of bathrooms, I'll talk about housing, like in cabins at camp. And what does that look like? And so this is another conversation where we have the uncomfortable, unsafe conversation. But when we get to that problem, like, what is at the heart of the concern? And like that parent that called camp that I mentioned earlier, that's like, well, I don't want my daughter seeing, body parts or whatever. Well, so what does it look like to normalize privacy? What does it look like to create standards of behavior and expectations of community that protect all people, including those who have histories of abuse and assault and all of those things? Because that unsafety that comes from being vulnerable in that way isn't the trans person's fault. Well, exactly. No, and I know you know that. But so what does it look like to normalize we talk about putting up changing rooms in cabins. Throw up a shower curtain in a corner. It's so easy. And normalizing privacy benefits all people, not just trans and non-binary people, not just LGBTQ people, but people who are struggling with eating disorders or body image or have experienced abuse, neglect, or assault. And so then what does it look like to continue to grow standards of being in community or different pieces of ministry that ensure that we are providing making accommodations so that each individual can feel as safe as possible without putting communities against each other? Because it's not actually about communities against each other. It's about saying, what do you need? What are your access needs to feel safe in this space? To deal with what you're particularly bringing in, because we all have access needs. We talk about access and accommodations a lot when we talk about disabilities, but we all have access needs. I have food allergies. I need food I'm not allergic to or I'm gonna die. Like, people need us to use microphones so that they can better hear. Some people need to be able to get up and move about the room because sitting for 2 hours is just not feasible for, so understanding that we all have access needs and normalizing that so then we can get into the practice of meeting everyone's access needs and creating opportunities for that.
It's tricky to have that conversation and make sure you're not ending up in some weird competition. Right, and that is reality. And I get that. So we have to have a conversation, and we need to ask a lot of questions so that we can drill down to where the actual originating harm is coming from, and do our best to make sure that for both of those people, that harm is what we're most concerned with, and hopefully we can work that out.
And whatever it is, we're still going to go by, we're not going to make someone unsafe in the hopes of making even someone else safer. And so it's the same thing. What do you need to feel safe? Well, these are options, but this isn't. The option isn't to say the trans person can't use this space, but we have all these other options to care for you because I understand that you are vulnerable in this way.
Right.
Yeah.
You talked earlier about was it the program Fearfully and Wonderfully Made here in this synod or New Jersey?
Oh, Faith, Hope, and Love.
Faith, Hope, and Love.
Yes.
Is that program still happening for young people, sponsored by the church and church leaders so that they have a place to go and unpack this and be with others that are still wrestling with these things for themselves?
So I would love to say yes in New Jersey. Right now we are looking for new leadership for that event in New Jersey because people that were running it didn't have capacity anymore. So up until, I think this is the 2024 was the first year we didn't have it. And so I'm hoping that finds new legs. But there are opportunities. There are wonderful youth ministry. I love to see the queer confirmation program, which is not geographically restricted, like that is available to everybody coming up. We have camps like the Naming Project, which is a wonderful ministry. In Minnesota, 1 week that happens during the summer. And then we have intergenerational events that are happening throughout. Southeast Penn has In God's Image, which is coming up really soon. October 12th, thank you. I knew someone in here would have the date. And there are variations. Faith, Hope, and Love inspired quite a few other events like that in synods across the LCA. And so starting to see those pop up. We also see retreat ministries or camp ministries where we have a specialty week of camp. And those are beautiful and we want those. And I also want to say we don't want to assume all our queer kids want to go to specialty programming. They want to be involved in the general ministry of the church as well and those opportunities. Yep, thank you for bringing that up. Well, I think we are at time. Thank you so much. If you submit your email, I'll send out resources. Otherwise, you can find us. I'm JamieBriesehoff.com. Just search my name. It's pretty distinct. And through me, you can get to him.
If you search my name, you come up with all kinds of stuff.
It's true. There's some scary stuff. There's scary stuff if you search either of our names.
He is the Rock.
Thank you.
Don't run away.
Oh.
Wait, there's more.
But wait, there's more.
I think we need to thank our speakers with all sorts of affirmation and applause. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sorry we didn't talk about toxic masculinity, something I've been running away from all my life, but that's another talk for another day. Overfishing or something, right? Yeah. But here's some swag from the seminary. We are so grateful to the both of you for being who you are and for loving and caring for God's people. And I have plans that involve the both of you for future continuing at events, and we'll talk more about that.
Awesome.
I'm very excited.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for being you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And everybody, of course, Jamie's going to be out at the table. We have a few copies of the book left, Amy. Great. They are $15 cash or check. Of course, you folks at home, hopefully you got the chance to get that QR code. If not, I'm going to be sending out an email to everybody who registered here in a couple of days with that link attached. And there are, of course, the flyers for all the other upcoming events for Kindling Faith. Not the least of which is we have this wonderful event in October about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and how it is that his life and legacy can teach us about our current cultural moment in time. And the Luther Colloquy, which is coming up October 28th. It is the 500th anniversary of the Achtliederbuch, so we will sing our Lutheran hymns, auf Deutsch maybe, who knows. And it is such a blessing. I think you all owe yourselves a round of applause, but that's kind of hokey, so we're not going to do that. But thank you for giving of your time and talent and for being prepped for ministry in the world through your presence with us today. You are a blessing to the church, and be a blessing to others as you go forth from this place. May the Lord bless you and keep you safe on your travels home. Thanks for being with us today. Rick?
You want to mention the Alumni Association?
I do. How did you know?
I thought you might.
The Alumni Association, Tulsa, is having an annual or biannual meeting at 4 p.m. in room 309. So it's all the way up to the top floor and in the boardroom. And then there is an alumni event following that, a happy hour is that in Benbow or Lull? Hey, guys. So just, pick a room where there's snacks, goodies, and people, and that'll be the place where it is. It starts at 5 p.m., I believe. Yeah. Hope to see you there. Take care.